Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast dedicated to the Malifaux meta in Los Angeles. My name is Jeff, and with me here today are Colgan and Jim.
Hey everyone.
Hey guys, what's up? Sorry, it took me a while to hear you out here on the other side of the country.
Yeah, it turns out Jim has left these sunny shores to return to muggy Maryland, and we look forward to hearing some East Coast insights once COVID makes that possible.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing, but we are still committed to bringing you guys content that is primarily driven from the Los Angeles meta. So what do we have today?
So today we thought we would talk about activations. You know, Colgan and I played a game recently at our local game store, and after that, we talked about how we approach activations and initiative, and we thought it might make a interesting topic for an episode. Today's episode is primarily intended for beginning players, but it could be of general interest to anyone who's played Malifaux and maybe looking to improve. And we should say, of course, that, as always, this isn't podium talk. We're not top rank players. We're not saying do what we do because we do it, but we wanted to sort of lay out the process that we use to evaluate things like initiative and activation order. So, to begin with, how do you go about deciding what to activate? And Colgan, you had some thoughts on, the method that people use to determine activation order.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I could speak in general, but it was something that after we talked a little bit about, I kind of gave some thought to. Once you get more comfortable with the game, most players will have an idea of which activations are important, when should you activate one model versus another, and everyone has to have some kind of decision process about how they arrive to which models on your crew have priority activations for a turn, and which ones are kind of less important. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking a little bit about how I do that, and I guess I'm curious to hear how you guys process this information as well. So for me, when I'm thinking about it, the first thing I want to keep in mind are what points can I score during the turn? What are my strategies? What are my schemes? And then I'll kind of narrow it down to which models of my crew are in a position to score those points, based on where they're positioned or which enemy models they're close to. And after I've narrowed it down to there, I need to start looking at how can my opponent deny me from getting these points, either by tying up my models so they can't take an interact action, or by potentially removing them from the game entirely if my model is kind of a little bit overextended. And then that will kind of keep going down the chain, what can I do to actually prevent the enemy models from interfering with my plan, and when do I need to activate, or what activations do I need to wait out before I can be confident that I can score this point or secure these points in a way that the opponent isn't able to deny me.
Right. What about you, Jim?
I mean, yes. One thing I wanted to hit real quick is that this is a feature that Malifaux has that other minigames don't. It is the I go, you go activation system, or alternating activations. And that's what really makes the game a lot more complex than the kind of games where a player gets to move all their dudes, shoot all their dudes, punch all their dudes, and do everything else without the opponent having any real way to reply until it's their turn to do all of that. And so the fact that every activation you have a different board state is I think going to be critical to this conversation, and is critical for me to my decision-making process, because I can think at the start of a turn, hey, I need to do these things to get somewhere, but 2 activations in and I might have to completely rearrange it. So I try and be a little more flexible. But a lot of the points that Colgan hit on, can I score points? That's kind of my first thing. Is anything I can do going to score me points or make it so I can score points? That's the highest priority. If I can deny my opponent points, that's probably going to be step 2. Because if I can't score points, if I deny you points, that's almost as good. And then step 3 is probably going to be, how can I engineer either scoring or denying points? So if I can get my Midnight Stalker into the enemy backfield to score or deny points, but I can't do it this turn, I'll figure out how I can do that best on the next turn and do it safely. Removing models from the field, either through berry mechanics or the more conventional killing them, is, I think, going to be the most readily accessible and most practical way, really, to deny points.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would actually say that when Colgan and I were talking about this in person, and he was explaining his concept for his how he approaches the game, and he had kind of described like this beautiful mind process where he's kind of seen 10 steps ahead and projected everything that every model could do. I suddenly was not so eager to play him anymore in future games. But I would actually say that because I am loss averse, and I know this about myself, I do not like losing models, even though that is part of the game. I actually find that my decisions are frequently dictated by model vulnerability. Mm-hmm. At a fundamental level, I do think Colgan is right. This is a game about scoring points. Probably everyone on a certain level is trying to evaluate how they can maximize the capabilities that they have to score points. But I just frequently find, oh geez, I've got the duet over there at 3 life. I need to move them across the board to Cassandra so that Cassandra can copy their bonus action and heal them 2 hit points. So, yeah, I think I probably don't approach the game at the table quite so intellectually. It's a bit more of a visceral experience for me, which is a gap in my play.
That's fair. I mean, we all play the game for different reasons and with different approaches, so that's good to know. But when we are talking about this decision tree stuff, we can spend all day talking about the theory, but let's do that. Let's talk about the theory. So, starting out, the turn structure starts with the initiative. In the game, we've already built our crews, we have our pie-in-the-sky goals, we have our schemes selected, but the very first thing you have a decision to make about in the game, like once the game is started and cards are flipping, is initiative. Turn 1. What do you guys do with initiative? How important is initiative to you turn 1?
I don't think I've ever cheated for initiative turn 1.
Which, if you listen to other podcasts, right now the Texas meta players are getting a lot of airtime. They're saying that basically turn 1 they're stuck in, which is a very different experience from how we play in Los Angeles and probably how most places play. And if I were in that environment, maybe I would care more. But I suspect even then, probably not. I would probably alter my play to simply be less vulnerable turn 1 in terms of positioning, and I still think I would be fine with however the initiative shaked out on turn 1. I mean, I would also say that even if I win initiative turn 1, I almost always pass play because again, I'm generally not too concerned with what's going on that turn.
Yeah. No, that is a common thing. I think every single game of Malifaux in 3rd edition that I've played, and heck, even in 2nd, is that on turn 1, it is desirable for your opponent to have first activation. Because in this game of I go, you go, turn 1, unless they have a model with the sniper ability that can, reach out and touch you from deployment zone to deployment zone, that turn 1, there's not a lot of interaction between models until the very end, like you alluded to with the Texas meta, and they're able to get in at the end. But even then, that's probably a walk, fly with me charge with Nikima. Or if your opponent was super aggressive, a walk, fly with me charge, punch with Nikima. Turn 1, the interaction between crews is often, in my experience, light, and so it's much more positioning. And when it's positioning, I value being able to move my important pieces near the end of the round on turn 1, after most of my opponent's pieces have moved, so that I know that I'm free from retaliation. Colgan, you mentioned that you had a game recently against an opponent who aggressively activated their models. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so this kind of goes into a little bit what we're discussing. I mean, the common concept of a threat range, basically in what area can a model potentially attack or affect that space. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of models, so I guess in this case I was playing against 10 Thunders, but for Dawn Serpent and Yasunori, for me, a lot of their power comes from the fact that, they have pretty good attacks. They're not necessarily like the best attacks in the world, but they have it on a very high mobility model, meaning that, they have a lot of passive board control, because when they have not yet activated for that turn, the potential places that they could go to stop a scheme runner or to kind of deny you points in a certain part of the board is very high, in my opinion. So in this game, my opponent decided to activate their Yasunori very early in the turn. And after he did that, the rest of my activations, I wouldn't have to worry about the Yasunori coming in and trying to pick off one of my scheme runners or one of my lower cost minions that I tend to move early in the turn, because I think the same with you, Jim. I don't think that their activations are as valuable, and I don't want to kind of give away too much information to my opponent about where I actually want to be moving towards, or an idea of which strategy or which scheme points I'm trying to score just based on my positioning very early in the turn.
Right. I actually find, because I play several engine crews, like Yanlo or McMorning, my first turn is frequently kind of dull for both me and my opponent, I'm sure, because I'm just trying to get my stuff set up, right? I'm trying to get my poison blowed out. I'm trying to abuse Chiaki and get reliquaries out, that kind of thing. And so, that is another reason why I don't really care about activation order, or not activation order, sorry, but initiative and who has the first play on the first turn. But once we, kind of move past the first turn, initiative, I think, becomes much more important. So how are you guys basically evaluating the importance of initiative as the game goes on?
For me, I think that turns 2 and 3 are going to be the most critical of the initiative flips, and that's because turn 2 is likely both crews are going to still have the bulk of their ability intact. Maybe there was a few wounds tossed here and there at the end of turn 1. Maybe someone got a lucky hit with a alpha strike and took off a model. But you probably still have a few more pieces on the field. So turn 2, if you develop a scrum in your game, it's probably going to develop turn 2, and you're going to trade the most blows then. After turn 3, either most of the pieces that are going to die will be dead, or most of the pieces that are going to be running schemes in the backfield are either through into the backfield or dead. So I just feel like the most action happens in those first few turns. And that's when you want to be able to go first. Because if you have a dedicated beater piece who can take off a model in an activation, I value activating those type of models early when they are able to leverage that power and remove an enemy model. Because activation control comes in a couple of flavors. You have pass tokens, you have just sheer numbers of activations, and then you have what I think is the strongest, which is taking away activations from your opponent before they have a chance to use them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Colgan, when would you look to cheat initiative? When do you find yourself doing that in games?
So, I will cheat for initiative if I'm able to secure a point early. So, for something like Symbols of Authority, if it's the top of turn 2 and I have a scheme runner in range to move in and pick up a token, but the opponent has, someone nearby that could possibly kill or just prevent my model from actually interacting, then I will give a lot of priority to that, because I'd like to know that I've secured my point for that turn, and it gives me a lot more freedom with the other activations I have left. So when I fight for activation control, though, it's typically because I only have one real option moving forward in that turn to try and secure points, or trying to deny the opponent a point. If I have multiple options on the turn and I lose initiative, I'm much less likely to cheat for it, because I would rather keep as many cards in hand as possible to try and, I guess, make any duels that happen during the turn as favorable as I can to me, instead of using that to try and get that one activation when I know that I have multiple options on the table for either securing more points or denying my opponent points.
Right. Sure, that makes sense.
That's a really good point, and I want to jump off from there with you, Colgan, because cheating 1/6 of your hand to try and secure initiative, that is a huge risk. and the reward is very variable. Like, the number of times that I've tried to cheat my initiative and either cheat to tie to force a reflip that I then lose, then I'm like, oh geez, now I'm down a card and I still lost initiative. And this is something that we'll talk about at a later date, or I might do a solo episode on. I've been thinking about how actions and cards relate to each other, and I'm pretty sure that the developers of Malifaux equate one card in hand to one action equivalent. Because of the number of actions that say discard a card to take another action. So if it says, if discarding a card to take a shot with rapid fire means that one card equals one shot, one card equals one action. If I'm sacrificing an action either by being able to discard it for that effect or to secure that action in the turn, am I sacrificing a future fact for this present temporary benefit? I guess the short answer or short statement is I don't like cheating initiative generally unless I can guarantee it. But if you guarantee initiative, that's usually a severe card. You could have guaranteed a hit with your beater. You could have guaranteed a dodged attack to defend your assassinated master.
Right. I think, I tend to find that, my desire to cheat for initiative or, to win initiative pretty much directly correlates to how desperate my position is. Because if I'm confident that I can achieve what I want to achieve, whether I go first or second, in a sense, it really doesn't matter which order I end up in. And so if I'm, not winning initiative, I don't really care. And when I actually find myself in that situation and and I feel confident in my options, and I also think that my opponent is under some pressure, these are actually situations where I like to cheat to tie if I can do so with a weak or a low moderate. I probably wouldn't, go above like a 6 or something. But if I think I can get a better card from my opponent by cheating, I've found that I've done that in the past. And I've also, interestingly, because it's obviously quite conjectural, right? I can easily misread how important initiative order is to my opponent. But I find that usually when I do this, I've guessed correctly. And I'm not sure the cause and effect, right? Like maybe my cheating to tie has, in a sense, elevated the value of winning initiative in my opponent's mind, or at least communicated to them that I care more about winning this initiative than I do. But, I do tend to find that when I cheat for initiative, I'm either behind or I only, as Colgan mentioned, I only have a very limited number, maybe even only one option to achieve what I need to achieve, or I'm doing it because I'm comfortable and I'm trying to bait out a resource. So, whether you cheat or not, very possible that you've won initiative. So, Jim, if you have won initiative, how do you decide whether or not you want to take the play or pass the play to your opponent? And for anyone playing the Other Coast drinking game at home, it depends.
Nope, it does not depend. I'm gonna flip it around, flip the script here. Going back to my decision tree earlier, I'll summarize by what can I do with this first activation to score points or deny points. If the answer is this activation will absolutely score me points, get that symbol marker torn down, drop that model to half for Vendetta, then I will take it and I will do that thing and I will spend the resources to make sure it happens, and then I'll be sitting pretty with that +1 VP. If I see that my opponent's first action is likely to be something to score a point, like if I see my opponent next to a symbol marker, then I might say, all right, I'll go and try and stop that. If I can, because that's one of the other things. If I could deny, but I know I can score myself, I'm going to take the thing that's most likely to happen. What's the point of the action? I guess come back to, what are my actions supposed to do? And if I don't have a compelling reason to go first, there are times when I will absolutely give my opponent activation on turns 2 or 3. Even though I just said a few minutes ago that those are the most important turns. And It could be that I don't see where I could be punished for doing that. And if I make them go first, odds are I get the last activation control.
Right. What about you, Colgan?
I think it's pretty similar. as I was saying, I'm going to be looking at where can I score points, where can I deny points. And I definitely agree with Jim. If I look at the board state and I don't see anywhere that I really need to activate, or sometimes it'll just be that during the turn there's too many variables for me to actually read through to the end of like a certain, I guess, like line of play, then I might just give that activation to my opponent. One thing, yes, having the last activation is great, but a lot of this game, a lot of Malifaux is just working off different board states and information. So the opponent moving first might give you some more information that kind of changes the priority of all my other models and what they need to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I think the board state is fairly static, I'm not weak anywhere, but then my opponent breaks off their beater model from a scrum and goes like towards the flank or something, then I suddenly have to reevaluate why are they moving their dedicated fighting model like away from a fight and towards a seemingly like unimportant part of the board. And then I can kind of change my activation order or the priority of my models based on that new information.
Right, right. So initiative has been settled, and now you're kind of looking at what you want to activate. And one aspect of this that Colgan and Jim, that you guys both mentioned, was board control as a feature of activation control. And I think that's an interesting concept, and I was wondering, if you wanted to explain a bit more what you meant by that. So, Colgan, what is board control as a a factor of activation control, or in related to activation control?
Yeah, so to me, board control is kind of, I think, as you had mentioned in the pre-show, this idea of potential energy. Like an unactivated model, they have a lot of lines of play that they could potentially go down. So for me, board control is basically having more possibilities in any area of the board than your opponent. If I have like 3 models to my opponent's 1 model, to me that signifies a sense of board control, because I have potential 6 actions with 3 different models to kind of set up for scoring points, for tying up their model, or kind of doing whatever I want on that side of the board. Whereas the opponent only really has 1 option to react to 1 of my 3 models. So I could activate 1 early and tie up his model. I could hold them all until he has activated his model. It gives me the ability to kind of do whatever I want on that side of the board without my opponent having a very efficient or effective response to that.
Right. And so, one consequence, or one feature of this rather, is your unactivated models are exerting an influence on the board, right? Just by virtue of what they could do.
Right.
And so I assume that means that the opposite, an activated model has lost that potential then, and it's no longer something that you have to worry about for the turn, right? I mean, of course, it could have abilities that are passive or that are still happening. Does that mean that you will, try to gain control of a region by, by trying to force activations so that your opponent can't react in a certain section of the board?
Definitely, yeah. That is one way to go about it. So I guess like one thing I want to preface this with is, even though I kind of laid out that I'm going to look at all my models that can potentially score and all the models my opponent can use to deny that, if that count gets to like more than maybe 2 activation turns, or more than like 2 or 3 models the opponent could effectively deny with, I don't feel comfortable reading down far enough to be like, okay, if I do this and this, I can secure this point. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to that, a lot of the times I'll start looking at ways I can just kind of simplify the board state, whether that be, like you said, forcing certain activations out of the opponent, or just holding certain activations on my side. So like that potential threat range that you're discussing, I might have a scheme runner in place to score a point, but if I move before the opponent's model, he can move there and either remove the scheme marker or somehow deny that point. And like, sure, there might be lines of play where if like I go with this model, I can stop that from even being a possibility. But a lot of the times it can be very difficult to read that far ahead, or to try and reliably predict your opponent's actions to that level.
Right.
So it's a lot easier to just kind of go with what you know and like surefire ways of shutting down an enemy model, or just, and you know, one of the most reliable ways is just making sure that they've activated. If you have one model on the side and I have one model on the side and I want to drop a scheme marker, the most sure way I can be of that you're not able to interfere with that is if your model has already activated.
Right. So, Jim, part of this, I think, a model that's activated can't activate again, and a model that has died can't activate, right? So, how important in your assessment is kind of risk management, or, trying to make sure that you get activations from vulnerable models before they die?
That's a tough one. Like you, I am loss averse, because I view my models as the tools I use to score points, but I also know that as far as micro building and playstyle goes, I will often have 2 or 3 models that are there for activation padding and for getting incidental things done. So it may not be the most efficient, but if I take 2 5-stone minions who are only there to help the rest of the crew, be a speed bump, be something that can be a significant activation, if they're the ones that are in threat, then I'm okay letting them die. Like, I am okay letting my pieces die unless I can reliably deny it. And if doing so doesn't cost me later in the turn. Feels real bad to spend a 13, your opponent pulls out the red joker.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't plan for that. But it still feels bad to spend a 10 and your opponent spends an 11. They kill your model, and you could have kept that card in hand to use on another model. But if I need that model to be alive for points, then I will pour resources to keep that model around and activate it as soon as I can to get it out of its dangerous position. If it's not directly tied to one of my schemes or my strategy, I think I'm more inclined to let my opponent have the attack and or have the threat. I think something that comes into this is, we've talked about it amongst ourselves, the revenge activation, to be mindful and aware of that. Because if you come in on my piece and you attack it and you kill my piece, I have to remember that piece that is activated is not going to be a threat to me until next turn.
Right. Sure. And yeah, that would be part of risk assessment, right? Yeah, if a model is already activated, then it's not threatening your other models. So, Colgan, again, I understand that a lot of this is based on your objectives for the turn, but if you remove models from the enemy side, it's going to limit what they can do, maybe this turn if the model isn't activated yet, but certainly in future turns, right? So how important to you is it to use killing as a, removing models as a method of obtaining activation control?
Oh yeah, that's great. If you can kill models, go for it.
It's the most reliable way to ensure you have control of the board state, and you make it make the game easier. There's fewer pieces on the table. There's fewer choices to be made for both sides. It's the ideal situation.
So, would either of you imperil or even maybe pass up a scoring opportunity in order to take actions that you think are going to give you greater board control for the rest of the game?
No.
I guess it depends what you mean. Again, this is going to be kind of looking at, potential for success, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of like reveals on schemes, I feel like a lot of the times I'm okay with like, okay, I'm not going to score this on turn 2, but I still have turns 3 and 4 to score the reveal. I'm okay with not kind of like showing what I might be trying to reveal to remove an enemy model from the board and to simplify the board state.
Mm-hmm.
For a strategy point, I would be in the same thought process as Jim. Like, no, like a strategy point, you can only score once that turn, and any turn you're not scoring it, you're just reducing your chances of winning that game. So if it's a choice between removing a model or securing a point, almost always go for that strategy point, unless it's going to be removing some very vital model, like if there's like a molly that I can take off that turn and just be like, okay, I might lose a strategy point this turn, but I know this is going to make it very likely for me to score the remainder of my strategy points for the rest of the game, then I do think it can be worth it.
Right. No, that makes sense. I think for me, I am a little more focused on board control, because obviously you want to score these points, but I think I am a little more willing to risk or even forego point if I'm confident that what I'm doing instead is going to give me a great advantage in board control, and especially in fighty crews, which might seem counterintuitive because fighty crews generally struggle to score more, or you have greater difficulties in scoring, rather, I should say, and so bypassing a scoring opportunity is a greater risk to your future points, which I completely think is true. But in my opinion, if you're bringing a fighting crew, a large part of your goal and how you're going to win this game is that you're going to obtain control of the board such that you can then do whatever you want and your opponent can't really stop you. That's your goal anyways. And in those instances, and even though Malifaux's not about fighting, pretty primitive, so my Malifaux games are often about fighting. And so I do find myself quite often just trying to obtain board control and make up the difference later. So let's talk pass tokens. Pass tokens are, an aspect of activation control. They allow you to pass instead of having to activate a model when it's your turn. They are an introduction to 3E. They didn't exist in 2nd edition. In fact, they were meant to patch what became a major issue in 2, and that was that some crews could summon out sort of these little freebie, little garbage models, and that they would activate all these little garbage models, and then you would activate your real models, and then you were left with nothing. All your models had gone, and they had only used their little throwaway minions, and so after you can't respond, they just go with their real models. So now the crew with fewer models gets pass tokens every turn, and when your opponent summons a model, you get a pass token. So even though they were meant to address a major issue in the game, do you guys find pass tokens to be significant in most games that you play? Jim, what about you?
I do not believe that pass tokens have solved the activation control issue at the heart of an I go, you go game.
Mm-hmm.
I find pass tokens to be on par with half an activation's worth of output. Back to that theory I have, I think one pass token is equivalent to one action and one card. And the reason I say this, yes, a pass token is you could spend it to pass a whole activation, but you don't change the board state. You're giving your opponent the opportunity to make 2 changes to the board state when you spend a pass token, which can go in their favor. It can go in your favor if your opponent can't make meaningful board state changes. But if your opponent has, a Yasunori and a Dawn Serpent, and I pass between their activations, that's 2 beaters that he gets to go with and do who knows what to my crew. So I find myself banking pass tokens on turns 2 and 3 and using them more for the initiative buff.
Are you finding your experience with pass tokens to be similar to Jim?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes... I think all the points he made, I would agree with. As far as exactly how to value pass tokens, I'm still not sure where I would put them. I definitely think it's better to have them than to not, right? Having that extra option during your turn is always great. I think it kind of comes down to how we were talking about the potential of a model, right? Even though we say that having an unactivated model, they have that threat range, during turns 2 and 3, when you're fighting or you're having that full-on contact with the enemy, you want to convert that potential energy into... I'm not sure what the actual term is, but to
kinetic.
Actual energy.
Or it's whatever kind of energy it is, right? Frequently it's kinetic energy, but yeah, it could be different kinds, I suppose. Especially if, I guess you're capable of matter to energy transfer, like Star Trek or something.
Okay, so we want to convert this potential energy into activation energy.
There we go.
Activation energy.
I like
it. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think for me, and I've talked about this on the forums or a weird place with other people before. Other people maybe seem to find pass tokens more impactful than I do in resolving activation disparity, especially with regards to summoning, which is kind of one of the major issues it was meant to solve. And for me, pass tokens can preserve the ability to react, but they don't increase your ability to act. So that, they're in no sense useless, because as we'll discuss later, there can be quite a lot of value in having that last activation, and pass tokens can keep you in the running for having it. But your opponent's still getting to act with all these models, whereas you're just having to sit there and wait. So I would agree with Jim. They're in no sense really a substitute for another model. Similar to pass tokens, well, not really similar, but another way, I guess, to kind of manipulate activation order are various abilities that would allow you to chain activate more than one model in between your opponent's opportunity to respond. Accomplice is I think one of the most common abilities that does this. How highly do you two rate abilities like Accomplice, or do you not rate them highly at all?
I have a love-hate relationship with chain activations, because most of them that I've seen in the game, they are resource intensive. So, for example, I think it is Accomplice. I don't have the app open, so sorry, Internet, I am wrong, I'm sure. But you have to discard a card or a pass token in order to chain activate. So you are saying, I'm playing Marcus, and I'm going to immediately chain activate into my Sabretooth. And when that's all done, I will have spent 3 activations worth of activation control. So the 2 activations in the pass token or the card from hand, plus whatever I'm spending cards on that I needed to have that double activation to accomplish. It's front-loading your turn or your activations into one spot because you need to stop your opponent from interrupting it. And generally speaking, I try and make decisions that my opponents can't interrupt or minimize their ability to interrupt it. This is a tool for that, but it feels bad to me to spend all those resources to do something when I could have just had 2 activations done in a way that I could control for my opponent's reaction.
Right.
Now, niche cases, of course, exist. Everyone take a shot. But, for example, against a hard-to-kill model with a crew that has healing, sure, I'll go with 2 beater models to try and kill it before it can heal. I think that's a valuable use of the actions, because in that case, if you give your opponent the chance to react, can they undo the work you've done?
Right. What about you, Colgan? Do you find Accomplice to be, largely of situational value?
Yeah, I think I'm in the same boat. Like, if I have, like, Accomplice or Companion on a model, like, I'm not going to complain, but it's also not going to be, like, the make or break thing that determines whether or not I take this model, right? Because it does tend to be a very situational thing. Like, when you need it, it's great, but like Jim was saying, most of the time when I'm playing, I want to engineer situations where I don't have to burn those resources to get that double activation to make something work.
Right. So, let me ask you guys a question then. Why isn't it the case that, with your 4 activations, even 6 with your bonus actions, you can't do something really great? Why do you find Accomplice generally isn't worth using?
What are you doing with those actions is the question. So, if you're, for example, doing attacks, because I find that I will prefer to use chain activations on murdering something really good. If I need 2 activations to do that, I'm either doing it with 2 subpar beaters, in which case I'm using subpar beaters in a beater role. That seems bad. Or I am using models that are really good at beating, and I might be taking 2 or more models off. And that's okay, but I could do that over the course of the turn and not give up the activation control. You say, you have 4 to 5 actions plus bonus actions, but how much are those 2 actions and a possible bonus going to do for you that it can't wait 1 activation?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see it. I think for me, I agree. I rarely find myself using chain activation abilities, and the most common situation where I do use them is when I can, where it's actually not going to cost me an activation, right? When I can chain activate to remove something that's important that hasn't activated yet. I'm basically just getting value and removing my, any value from my opponent on that model. Even in the other side, the army scale game set in Malifaux universe, and it uses a lot of this similar rules frameworks. In that game, chain activations are much simpler to achieve, and I still, find myself using it quite sparingly. And I think a lot of it comes down to this sort of potential energy concept that we've been discussing, and that it empties out a lot of your options when you activate at that kind of rate. So, let's talk about last activation, because this is a concept that we've touched on a couple times, but we really haven't talked about it. And the last activation in the turn, all three of us have mentioned that it's something of value to have. But why is the last activation important, and how important is it? Colgan, what are your thoughts on the last activation of the turn?
It depends. But yeah, it's like, what are your schemes and what are your strategies? A lot of the times the last activation is important because it gives you the opportunity to do something that your opponent cannot react to, that they, otherwise would have a second to catch up to, or maybe like figure out what your grand scheme to score these final points is going to be. But, it's like last activation isn't important, if during the first activation of a turn, you're able to secure that point, because, you can't score more than 1 point in turn. So I think it's something to keep in mind. It's not something that I think you should always be like, no matter what, I have to get the last activation in a turn, because if you're not able to convert it into anything meaningful, like, it doesn't matter.
Right. And just to that point, as we said, Malifaux is an alternating activations game. And if you look at the schemes and strategies that they've released, both in the core rulebook, Gaining Ground Season 0, and Gaining Ground Season 1, most of the scoring requirements provide ample counterplay for the opponent once either they suss it out or they are revealed and the opponent knows what it is. So, as a balancing mechanism, as a bit of fairness, once your opponent knows what you're trying to do, they have the tools to stop you with their activations. So last activations is the officially, technically legal, unfair way to secure your points.
Sure. For me, actually, this concept of counterplay is quite important to how I value last activations. And I think I probably place more of a premium on last activations than sounds like either of you guys do it. I mean, obviously, you both recognize the value in being able to act without your opponent reacting. But last activation is something that I intentionally try to achieve in most turns. I'm not always successful. It's obviously going to depend a lot on the board state and what the crew compositions are like. But I do value having that, and counterplay is a large part of it. I don't know how familiar you guys might be with kind of competitive level chess, but there's a great YouTube channel called Power Play Chess, hosted by Daniel King, he's an English grandmaster. He doesn't play competitively anymore, but he's a very well regarded chess commentator. And one of the things he does when he analyzes these high level games is he's always illustrating the value in counterplay, in the ability of having having the capacity to react to what's on the board in maybe an indirect way, right? Like if your opponent is strong on one side of the board, then instead of maybe trying to meet strength with strength, you might play towards the other side of the board, or create complications where they're weaker, and that will force them to kind of add to the mental load of, is it worth it to try to stop them? Do I need to peel off resources from what I'm doing? Even if I do so, can I win? And I find that last activation really helps with counterplay, and it cuts down pretty significantly on my opponent's ability to generate counterplay, because I'm going to be able to do the last thing of the turn. And I also find that having the last activation clarifies for me how important initiative will be for the next turn, so that I'm not left wondering, at the time of the initiative flip, whether or not I need to cheat it. I generally, my last activation of the turn and then my first activation of the next turn, they're kind of a package deal for me in most of these kind of crunch moment situations.
Interesting. I hadn't really considered the connection between last activation and initiative the next turn in that way before.
I mean, it's kind of like a free chain activation. if you need to go first, right? And if you do end up going first.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and I think a lot of this, again, it's part of my play style, which is a bit more hesitant, I think, than probably is ideal, in fact. But because because of the way that I play, I do really kind of value this ability to have the last say for the turn. But, either way, whether you've got the last activation or not, someone's going to have it. Now, one thing, I think it's great to have a plan, right? What you want to do with your activations or what you want to do with the last activation. But as we all know, the plans rarely survive contact with the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes things go against you, right? So, what are some things that maybe you guys do to try to, reevaluate your changing needs during the turn?
Yeah, I guess this kind of plays into what we were talking about, like revenge activations, where you're just trying to like kill the model that killed your guy and messed up your plan. I think it's something very easy to fall into, and it's something it's still a gut reaction I need to fight against.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, screw this guy for messing up my beautiful plan. Like I was going to get all these points. And I think it honestly just helps to just pause for a second, kind of like clear your mind, and then just think about, all right, so what points can I still score during this turn, or what points can I deny, or how can I set up for later turns in the match or in the game? And it's kind of just being able to almost remove yourself from the game a little bit. I know there's a tendency that a lot of people have where I think you start tying like your own ego and self-worth to the outcome of a game, right? So if you get like trashed in a game, or if you're just losing by a lot, it starts to feel like a personal attack.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to remove yourself, because there's this idea that, oh, if you're good or you're a smart person, you're going to win like all your games of Malifaux. But if you ever look at like anything at the competitive level, like the people that are marked as being like undefeatable have maybe like a 54 or like 55% win percentage against like people of a similar level. So if you're winning all of your games, to me, that just kind of signals that you're not in like an environment that's competitive for you, and you're not actually necessarily improving as much as you could be.
Right. No, that makes sense. I'm willing to bet that, obviously it's hard to quantify these things mathematically, but I'm willing to bet that the activation immediately after getting bad luck is significantly less effective than it should be, right? Like, you do something and you Black Joker, like whatever you do next, I'm betting just like across the board of Malifaux players is less effective than it should be. Again, because of like this psychological aspect, right? I mean, we're not machines. The things that happen in the game impact us. And one example I have actually is I was playing a player from our meta. He was playing Euripides and I was playing Misaki, and I jumped out actually to an early lead because he kind of overcommitted early, and I won the fight and removed a couple of key models. And I jumped out to pretty firm board control. But then, a sequence of unlikely events occurred, and I found my activations were taking on kind of like a tilty aspect, like it, sort of more frustration based. And so, although it's difficult, the ability to kind of step back and, ask yourself, okay, what am I about to do? Does it make sense? Is it the right thing? Is it going to score me points? Is it going to win me the game? Is a good capability to have.
So I have to say, tilt is a fact of any game. And I, for a very long time, was the guy, Colgan, you were talking about, who placed a lot of their self-worth into the performance of the game, and being like, if I did well, oh man, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And if I did bad, oh man, I am never going to play this game again. Wah. And then I grew up, and found out that I was in fact playing with little plastic dolls that I painted and built. And in a week, I would either have learned something from the game, or I would have forgotten something from the game. But at the end, what mattered to me was the experience playing the game. Now, obviously, in like a competitive setting and a tournament setting, it is easier to get on tilt, and in those settings, you have consequences to your actions. Be they from losing the match and possibly losing a podium spot to, not to me, but in other games and in other tournaments, people have been asked to leave because they got so out of sorts, so tilted. So I guess I had to develop early on the idea of, hey, it is a game, and remember the tagline of Malifaux, bad things happen. You're going to flip that Black Joker on that bonus action, or on that summon, or on that once per turn thing you get to do. And that's just how the game goes. You have to, if your game is lost because of one bad flip, it's probably not because of that one bad flip.
Right.
It's because you got in a position where that was the case. But tilt is a factor of the game, and a lot of that, to me, is also in how you interact with your opponent. Because I will find it much easier if I celebrate the Jokers, and I celebrate the red Jokers with my opponent, and mourn the black Jokers with my opponent, because then it feels like it's a shared experience rather than, oh man, I flipped and you flipped the black Joker, haha, stinks to be you, I'm the best. So I think there's an actual player element there, and if you are a good sports person, your opponents are going to have a better game and have less tilt overall, which I hope is, certainly for me in my games, the preference is to avoid tilt. And since I play janky stuff that can cause tilt, which there are certain keywords in the game that actively increase tilt.
Yeah, I would agree. Definitely the social aspect is a huge thing. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is, everyone wants to have, hopefully everyone wants to have fun. But I think, two things are important to remember is, how people derive their enjoyment from Malifaux isn't necessarily going to be from the same things. We talked about this a little bit, in our meta, there's people that really love the hobbying aspect of it. They enjoy playing the game as well, but what they like seeing the most is probably seeing, painted miniatures moving across the board. And it's kind of important to keep that in mind and try and keep in mind and have an idea of what your goal is for the game. And if you're able to make the experience a great experience for your opponent, win or lose, then you're much more likely to be able to get more games in the future. More people will want to play with you, as opposed to being the guy that flips the table when things don't go their way. I think you'll find very quickly that you're going to have a hard time finding opponents.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
There are some games that, even for me, it'll depend on the game, that I'll find myself, I only really have fun when I win. And to me, that's a sign that I need to stop playing this game, because at most, I'm going to enjoy it half the time. And that's not worth it to me. Right.
Or you're going to find an environment where you're not really being challenged, right?
Right.
I mean, I love this game. I win all the time. And, it's because I go down to the local preschool to play. I definitely agree. So, tilt is probably a good way to transition into our last section. What are some common activation mistakes that we have seen from newer players and that we make ourselves? And I guess the first one to talk about, and we've already kind of touched on it, is this concept of the revenge activation. Colgan, how would you define a revenge activation?
Yeah, I just want to start by saying this. I've definitely done all of these and probably still do these. But yeah, as we were saying earlier, revenge activation is basically when you're trying to kill or remove a model that's already activated for the turn, even though there's no value to it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
This is specifically that emotional response to, he killed my guy, I need to prove that I'm as good or better than they are by killing them back. Mm-hmm. And actually removing any advantage you had. And sometimes it's the model they removed, they actually made the wrong decision in focusing their efforts in trying to kill your minion over here, when they really should have been trying to prevent you from scoring points somewhere else on the board.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I would actually probably go even further in that, of course, removing a model or doing damage to a model has value in itself. But I would say that, for me, revenge activations are kind of subjective. So no one will truly know whether or not what you've done is a revenge activation. But whether or not the activation had value, if you're doing it as an emotional response to something that your opponent has done to you, to me, that's a revenge activation. And so just the fact that you are motivated by that emotional response should immediately call into question the value of what you're doing, or like whether or not you could be getting more value somewhere else, right? So like if their Pale Rider kills my mannequin, right, and then my duet is able to come in and do a bunch of damage to the rider, that's an action that had value, right? That's a sequence that probably was in my benefit. But if I only activated the duet because of this, like, oh, I'm gonna get even with you mentality, which isn't always so clear cut, but it's not necessarily that you saw red and then just went. But if that was kind of in my mind as to what made me activate what I did when I did and to do what I did with it, to me, that loss of objectivity is the thing to kind of to work on improving.
And you want to know the number one cause of most revenge activations?
Tell us.
Misreading threat ranges. Because let me tell you, I think I know what most cards do, and now that I'm on Vassal, I think I can cheekily check things like, oh, this model has a 5-inch move and a 2-inch melee range, so it has a 7-inch threat. I can threat out this far. Do that quick 7-inch aura check. You're just in. Perfect. I'm going to go and I'm going to charge, and then someone's going to casually remind that there's a rock wall in the way. So, no, I can't. Or, on the other side, I'll move my model up the field and then have an opponent go, oh, I happen to have a lure effect, and now your model's pulled out of position. And, I think that's the big thing, is there's a lot of models in Malifaux. There are a lot of different rules and abilities, even with the condensation that we had in 3rd edition. That's not the right word, but it's the word I'm going to use. Like, there's a lot to remember, and it's hard to be mindful of it. I think that this is why, if you're starting out in Malifaux, or even intermediate in Malifaux, learn your keywords. So, probably best to pick the ones that you want to play, and play them consistently, so that you get to know what your threat ranges are, so that you don't accidentally plan for having something in gun range, and then find out you're 2 inches out of gun range, and then that whole activation is lost. Likewise, it is definitely a good plan for you to ask your opponent questions about what their models do. And when in doubt, ask really simple, explain it to me like I'm 5 style questions. Like, I have never faced off against a Red Chapel crew before. What do you do? Where can you go with Seamus? What can he kill with his gun? Most players are looking to give you the information because it's game knowledge, they know it, and it's easier to get it from someone who knows their keyword, right? So when someone's asking you a question, try and figure out why they're asking, not to the point so that you can counter their play, but to answer the question they're really asking. So if I'm saying, like, what's the charge range on the Victorias? I may be asking, their charge range is 5 plus their engagement range of 2. But I can also say, they have the ability to walk 3 times, or walk twice and charge, plus battle tempo, so they have an effective range of like 20 billion inches.
Right.
So
right.
I would give that level of answer to a person, because that way they know both, like, okay, this is their charge, but they can threat this. When you're getting into that threat range discussion, you don't want to be, well, actually, you didn't ask what I could reach with a walk and a whatever.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point, right? You should, when someone asks you a question, if it's clear that you really understand what the subtext, what they're really trying to get is, I think the sportsman thing is, definitely to provide that information. Colgan and I were actually talking, I think players should feel comfortable asking questions. There's nothing, this isn't hidden knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Asking, what the range of something is, or, whether a model has the ability to do something. Those are valid questions. And if you're a newer player, you shouldn't feel any embarrassment at all, because, I think one of the things Colgan and I kind of identified is that probably the less experienced players ask fewer questions. So it's not an indication at all that you're holding up the game or that you don't know what you're doing, because experienced players ask a ton of questions, and as much as you know about Malifaux, it's impossible to know everything about every model. And even if you're really familiar with an opposing crew, you're still not going to remember, the range of every single action, or, you're not going to have that information at instant recall every time, right? So you should definitely feel free to ask questions, and if your opponent is, a decent human being, they're going to answer. And if they're not, you just have to open up the app and spend the time to answer the question yourself. Although at that point, you should also be evaluating how much you want to play with that person ever again.
Yeah, at that point, just walk away from the table.
Right. So, Colgan, aside from asking questions, what's something else that you might suggest a player, either a newer player or a player who has kind of been struggling with determining how to activate models, or order activation, can do to improve?
So one of the things, especially if you're in a meta with like a lot of players that are more experienced in the game, I think maybe just asking them if they'd have time to do kind of sort of like a teaching game, which is something I've been experimenting a little bit with, where I'll basically play a game, but I'll just kind of be very proactive in like talking or having everyone talk through their activations, like what they're trying to accomplish, and trying to like almost kind of like work together to like see the best way to do these things, to try and get them more comfortable with their crew, or let them know like how you tend to process information or look at the game in any given state.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, asking questions is always great. I think if you can be very specific with your questions, that's better. Of course, if you're able to understand what the person's really asking, but you might as well save the possible misunderstanding and save your opponent the mental load of trying to like read underneath to find your actual question, and just be like,
Right.
Oh, if I move here, do you have any models that could prevent me from dropping a scheme marker? Or if I drop the scheme marker here, do you have a way of removing it? If I do this, do you have a counterplay available to you? And in casual play, I would hope that you have an environment where like people are very forthcoming with this information. Most people I play with, they want to improve at the game or make better decisions. And there's no reason not to be like just asking whether or not an action is possible, because at some point during the game, you're going to have to figure it out. You might as well do it before you commit to an action.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. For me, I think one thing that can help is to have a purpose for your models and for your models activation. And I know that sounds simple, but I find even myself that there are instances where I'll activate a model and I won't really care that much about what that model does. And if I'm really winning the game, okay, maybe it's not a big deal, right? But if in most cases, even if I'm winning, I'm not winning by so much that I can afford to not care about what someone does. And yet, like, I'll activate and I'll walk in focus because I don't really have another clear plan with that model. And what that means is that I've probably made a mistake with that model. I've failed to identify a good purpose for it. So, if I activate a model and I don't have a clear vision for what I want to do with it, I have probably made a mistake with that model. And, again, that doesn't mean that you can map out what you want to do with every single model on every single activation. But it does mean that when you activate a model, it should be on purpose, right? You should be activating this particular model at this particular moment to do this particular thing. And if you've activated and you've just walked and focused or made an attack that you didn't really care about, the fact that you don't care about what happens is probably an indication that you're making a suboptimal play, which isn't to say that you can't get value from it, and it could even turn out to be quite advantageous sometimes because there are luck elements to this game. But just having a clear purpose for what you're trying to do is going to help focus your play and probably improve performance overall.
Gotta say, a lot of what we've been talking about is stuff that comes with time. Figuring out what you want to do with your models, trying things out with your models, figuring out what your opponent plans to do, and just generally assessing the board state. That's any game, that's any player. There are a couple of ways that we think you can really get that improvement going, and we've touched on them through this conversation. Questions is the first step. Another one is improving your model knowledge. Jeff, you're saying you might activate models and not know what to do with them, but if you spend time, reading up on it in the morning while you're eating your breakfast, maybe you'll have an idea of something to try with them in your next game, right?
Yeah, definitely. Knowledge, model knowledge, and scheme knowledge, which is, also very important. Those are things that are entirely at a player's control, right? They don't require an opponent. They don't even require like a large block of time. It doesn't take that long to kind of go through your own keyword of models. And sure, if you want an encyclopedic knowledge what everything does, you're in for the long haul. But if you're newer, or if you've just picked up maybe a new crew, spend the time it takes to kind of learn what those models do. If you find that you frequently don't know what you're trying to do to score your schemes, maybe consider spending a little bit of time brushing up on your scheme and strategy knowledge, because that'll help you figure out what you need to do. It'll make it easier to suss out what your opponent's trying to do, and obviously that will simplify any of your goals to obstruct them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think increasing knowledge is one way that anyone can improve in the game, no matter where you're at. So I think we've probably beaten initiative and activation control to death, and yet there's probably still hours more that we could spend talking about it, but I'm sure you're all sick of hearing from us. So if you've listened, we do appreciate it. If you would like to let us know how we're doing with a comment or an email, we'd love to hear from you. We play here in Los Angeles, and apparently now in Maryland. And we would like to be part of the wider Malifaux community, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast. So please let us know what you think, whether you think we're right, whether you think we're wrong, whether you think we're good or bad. We just appreciate any feedback. If you'd like to leave us a like or a share, that would be appreciated. And we also have a Patreon and a PayPal, and the details for those are in the show notes. So if you'd like to support us in that way, that would also be appreciated. Other than that, I think that's going to be it for us for tonight. So thanks for listening.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.